We're facing a global crisis. And as scientists, we often feel some responsibility for telling people what we know. In effect, we are the physicians of the planet. And we can tell people the truth, that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and the time to act is now. Here's the thing though, realistically, our own time is the most valuable and most non-renewable resource that we have. And if we're in academic positions, we're often told that we will be evaluated based on research, teaching, and service. But we all know that the right-hand figure represents reality, which is that we're evaluated on research, a little bit of teaching, tiny sliver of service. So when we're talking about outreach, it goes into that little narrow window, not just in terms of what we're evaluated on, but in terms of our time as well. So how can we do outreach effectively if we feel that that is our responsibility? And I would emphasize it isn't everyone's, because we're all good at doing different things. But how can we do it effectively while retaining our sanity? As someone who threw themselves into this very enthusiastically over 10 years ago and has probably committed just about every mistake or error that you can imagine, I wanted to share with you today the 3 big lessons that I've learned. Number 1 is to focus on what you do best and most effectively. No scattershot. Number 2 is to learn from those who have gone before. There's a ton of research. There's a lot of people who have tried things. Find out what works and what doesn't. And then number 3 is to practice, because it really does make perfect, and evaluate yourself. What works, what doesn't? Where should you or shouldn't you be spending your time? So let me explain each one of these, and let me also give you some real-life examples of what I do in each category myself. Start with number 1, focus. At the very beginning, ask yourself, how much time do you have realistically to spend on this? What goal or goals would you like to accomplish? And make sure that they're realistic so that you don't get overly discouraged. What are your particular strengths and talents? And what do you enjoy doing? Because there's no point doing something that you don't enjoy doing. Do you enjoy writing or making videos, social media, talking to kids? And who are you? So what audience can you best connect with in a way that another scientist might not? These seem simple and they seem straightforward, but as we go down this list, it helps to close doors to things that are not uniquely suited to you or things that you don't enjoy or you're not good at. And it also helps to focus on where you can be most effective with the limited time that you have. So let me give you some examples for me. Who am I? Obviously, I'm a scientist, and we connect with each other all the time subconsciously over our shared love of science and curiosity for understanding this planet. But I'm also Canadian. I live in Texas, so I connect with people over the experience of living in both of those places. I am a skier. I enjoy outdoor sports. I'm a mom, so I care about my kid. I'm a Christian, so I often connect with people who share my faith. What are you? You could be somebody who birds or hunts or hikes or skis. You could be somebody who enjoys knitting or cooking, somebody who paddles or dives, someone who was a scout or is a member of the Rotary Club or some other type of organization. You could belong to a community of faith. You could have kids. You could simply live somewhere, anywhere. But make an inventory of who you are, because that's the basis for connecting with people through a shared filter of what's important. So how do I focus on what I enjoy and what I feel like I'm best at? First of all, I focus in terms of reaching people that I have the most in common with. For example, there are a lot of us who ski, and so while I would love to work with Protect Our Winters, I've actually turned down a couple of invitations to do so because I feel like there's a lot of other climate scientists who could do that, and because I only have limited time, I want to spend that with people and organizations where I might be the only climate scientist that they're willing to trust because of other aspects that I share with them. I like to talk. I'd rather be the person giving the eulogy than being in the coffin at the funeral, so to speak, and I like to be brief. So I tend to focus on opportunities like videos, presentations, and on social media, Twitter, because it is short and it is sweet. I also lay out my availability for doing outreach in my calendar 6 months in advance. And I look for ways to turn my outreach into research and teaching so it's actually part of those other aspects of my life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about evaluation. Then for step 2, there's learning. I will never forget the first time I went to a media training workshop by the Union of Concerned Scientists. I was absolutely blown away by the fact that there is a science to effective communication. I know it sounds kind of ridiculous, like why wouldn't there be? But I had no idea that people had studied this, that they knew what worked and what didn't work. It was like scales fell from my eyes. So thankfully today, it's not so hard to find good workshops, good training materials. AGU has it, AAAS has it, many scientific societies have it, sometimes even universities offer it. There's many programs that people can become part of where there's leadership training and communication training. There's also research, a ton of research out there. A lot of it in the peer-reviewed literature. But I'm also very grateful that there's a lot of books that have synthesized it, so you don't have to dig through hundreds of articles that have now been published in just the last 10 years on effective communication and framing. Let me give you some examples of books. George Marshall's book on how our brains are wired to ignore climate change. A book called Climate Change in Society that's a summary of many different sociologists' work. It's an edited volume. There's a new book by Max Boykoff called Creative Climate Communication. Another new book by a social scientist from Australia called Rebecca Huntley called Talking Climate. And then there's fantastic websites and manuals and other tools available from the Climate Outreach Program from the UK, from the Yale Program on Climate Communication, and from the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. There's also other books that don't really have climate in the title or might not even have it anywhere in the book. But in a way, I feel like I've almost learned more from those books than I have from books directly about climate. Like what? Like The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, or The Influential Mind by Tali Sharot, who's a neuroscientist, and of course Haidt is a psychologist. I'm Right and You're an Idiot by PR expert Jim Hogan. And some of the key messages that I've learned from these resources are this. Number 1, we aren't just believers or deniers when it comes to climate change. We are spread out over a spectrum. And in fact, the majority of people are already alarmed or concerned about climate change. It's just that we don't talk about it. There's this silence issue. And then people who are cautious, I've also learned, lead with their doubts. So they often get mistaken as dismissives, when in fact they're just saying, hey, I heard this, is it true? And they're open to dialogue and conversation on that if it's done in a respectful way. I've also learned, though, that the 7% of people who are dismissive really can't be convinced. Not without a miracle, that is. And frankly, I don't believe that I personally am in that business. As Ed Young, who's a well-known science writer, just said, I saw him say this on Twitter as I was preparing my presentation, he said, it's like staring into the abyss, and the abyss is shouting LOL hoax into your mentions. Absolutely. There is no reason to engage with the loudest voices. We want to engage with the people who can actually be moved, who are concerned, cautious, even disengaged, and potentially doubtful. When we engage with them, also I've learned that it's not just about giving people more facts, more information, or more education. Dan Kahan's work has found that people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned about climate change. They were the ones who were most polarized about it. In other words, the smarter we are, the better able we are to cherry pick the information that we need to show that we're right on issues that touch directly on our sense of identity and worth. And of course, climate change is now number 1, the most politicized issue in the entire country. And it's actually been right at the top since the Obama administration. I also learned from neuroscientist Tali Sharot that more information in this internet era actually makes the problem worse. As we're exposed to contradicting information and opinion, she says, polarization expands with time. Wow. But research by Chris Chu, one of my colleagues right here at Texas Tech, has shown that when we bring climate change here and now, talking about how it's affecting us in the places where we live, that actually decreases psychological distance and political polarization as well, which is amazing. And then something else that I've learned is that, well, we need to have a clear understanding of how bad this thing really is. As humans, our brains are wired to freeze when we are overloaded with fear and anxiety and we don't know what to do with them. So I've learned that as we're increasingly worried, anxious, even scared about climate change, what we need to do is we need to share information that explains how it affects us here and now and what we can do to fix it so people have actions that they can take. This is breaking the cycle of fear, anxiety, paralysis, and then climate just changing more. And part of what we can do that's very effective is by telling stories, because when we tell stories, it actually synchronizes our brain waves with each other. If I'm telling a story, then your brain wave synchronizes with mine, and I would love to tell stories. We just don't have enough time here. And that takes me to the last one, which is to practice, and evaluate yourself. Are you meeting your goals? This is a tough one. And so I would just give you a couple of suggestions here. First of all, I listen very carefully to the questions I get from people, because those questions are things they want to know that I did not communicate. Even if I thought I communicated it, if they're asking the question, I didn't do so clearly. I also look very carefully on social media at what people like and share the most. For example, people really like stories about solutions by unexpected actors like faith groups or farmers on Facebook. That's what they like the most. Ask for honest feedback from people who you trust and respect. Give them a bit of an easy time because it's hard to criticize, but say, hey, what do you like best? And what do you think could be most improved, for example? I've even done some research looking at whether a talk that I would give to college students actually affected their opinions or not, whether it made a difference, whether they were in person or watched an online video. It turned out it didn't, which is part of why I do global weirding. And we've also done experiments with Christian colleges, and we found something truly remarkable, is that when you look across a spectrum of 3 different Christian colleges, which are very politically conservative, a little bit less politically conservative, and then pretty politically neutral. You have to go to Canada to get one of those on climate change. And then when they're all exposed to the same 30-minute video, their opinions on climate change all rise to the same level. So in other words, we see the greatest gains for the most conservative group. And when I saw those results, it made me feel like that's why I'm still in Texas, because you can get the greatest gains by talking to people who are most conservative. So I go around this circle every year. Every year I focus. Every year I learn. Every year I evaluate and reallocate my time. But I don't know if you've realized something here. These strategies are all individual strategies. But when it comes to outreach, we don't have to be lone rangers. We are all in this together. We're not competing for an NSF career grant that has a 5% funding rate. It's not a zero-sum game. What is at stake here is the future of our shared home. When one loses, we all lose. So to conclude, I wanted to emphasize one last lesson. Remember, you are not alone. Collaborate, seek out mentors, and promote each other. Your win is my win. So that's one of the reasons why I created that list of 3,135 scientists who do climate on Twitter. When we all went into lockdown in the spring, I offered my class videos that I had actually coincidentally just finished and got 109 faculty and instructors from 34 states and 22 different countries, including Kyrgyzstan and India, asking for resources, which I was absolutely happy to share because education helps us all. And if you haven't seen the book All We Can Save yet, let me recommend it to you. It is a true labor of love by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Katharine Wilkinson to highlight the voices of 60 women working in the climate sphere. These are the type of collaborative efforts that we can do because outreach, engagement, telling people it's real, it's us, it's serious, and we need to act, it is the opposite of a zero-sum game. When one person wins, we all win.